Let's talk about conditional statements, which is another way of saying the precise way that we write sentences in geometry in order to be able to form logical arguments. This lesson, and actually all of the lessons in this entire unit, are going to kind of almost make you feel like you're in an English class instead of in a math class. We're going to be dealing very little with numbers in these lessons and a lot more with words. So before we go any further, let's make sure we know what kinds of words we know. For example, what is a noun, what is a pronoun, and what is a verb? Go ahead and pause the video and write down how you would define each of these parts of speech. Okay, let's see how you did. A noun is a person, place, or thing. For example, in geometry, words like point or line or angle. And in the real world, words like elephant. Those are all nouns, because they're a person, place, or thing. But what's a pronoun? A pronoun is a word that takes the place of a noun. For example, it instead of point, or they instead of lines, or he or she or we if we're talking about people. All of those would be a pronoun because they take the place of a noun. And last, what is a verb? A verb is an action word. It tells you what something is doing. For example, in geometry, we might say that lines intersect, or we might say that we add or divide numbers, or that we measure an angle. Another verb that commonly gets overlooked is the verb to be, which gets conjugated as is, are, were, am, all of those types of words. That's also an action word. We're going to need to know all of these three parts of speech in order to correctly form the sentences that we're going to be writing today. And those sentences are called conditional statements. Every conditional statement has two parts, a hypothesis and a conclusion. The hypothesis is whatever follows the word if, and the conclusion is whatever follows the word then. For example, this is a conditional statement. If it is noon in Georgia, then it is 9 a.m. in California. It is noon in Georgia is the hypothesis. That's the stuff that follows the word if. And then we have a comma and the word then. And then it is 9 a.m. in California. That's the conclusion of our statement. And for our next few examples, I just want us to translate normal everyday sentences into a conditional statement, which means you'll have to have if, and then some stuff, and then a comma, and then some other stuff. Let's take a look. A person who lives in St. Louis lives in Missouri. That's something that a normal everyday person might say. But we're in geometry class now, and we need to write this in a specific way so that we would be able to form a logical argument with this statement. So it has to start with the word if, and then I need the first half of the sentence I was given. Well, the first half is a person lives in St. Louis. And then I'll write a comma and the word then, and then the second half of the sentence, which is that they live in Missouri. So I would say something like this. If a person lives in St. Louis, comma, then they live in Missouri. So these two sentences are really saying the exact same thing. The second one is just written as a conditional statement. If hypothesis, then conclusion. Let's try another one. Numbers that are divisible by 10 are also divisible by 5. The first half of that sentence will be my hypothesis, and the second half of that sentence will be the conclusion. So I could write something like this. If a number is divisible by 10, then it is divisible by 5. Notice that each time we write a conditional statement, it follows the same format. I start with the word if, then I have a noun, which is number in this case, then I have a verb, which is in this case, and then some other information. Then I'll have a comma and the word then I have a pronoun, it, and another verb, is, and then some extra stuff. This is the general format that you would expect to see for every conditional if-then statement. Let's try a third example. People who use their cell phone during class will have their phone taken away. We all know that, but let's go ahead and write it as a conditional statement. If a person uses their cell phone during class, then they will have their phone taken away. You might have said, well, hold on, I wrote that a little bit differently. I said if people use their cell phone during class, then they will have their phone taken away. Is that okay? And yeah, it is, because it's saying the same basic thing. So minor changes to the original sentence don't make a huge deal, as long as you're following the general format. If, noun, verb, stuff, comma, then, pronoun, verb, stuff. Let's try one that's a little bit more challenging. Collinear points lie on the same line. A common mistake that I see students make on a problem that looks like this is they'll write this statement. If collinear points lie on the same line, then, and then they don't know what else to say because there was nothing else in the statement, so they make something up. Don't do that. Remember that the format is supposed to be if, noun, verb, stuff, comma, then, pronoun, verb, stuff. The problem is, in our original sentence that we were provided, there was only one verb, which is lie. But we need two verbs. So with one like this, that you only have one verb, cut the sentence in half right there. On the left-hand side of the yellow line is the hypothesis. On the right-hand side of the yellow line is the conclusion. But if I just write it like that, it doesn't really make sense in English. If I just say, if collinear points, then lie on the same line. What is that actually trying to say? Well, we kind of need to reorder our words and add an extra verb that we weren't given in the original sentence to make this make sense. I can't just say, if collinear points. To make that make sense in English, you would say something more like, if points are collinear. See how I added a verb in there? So it's following that same format of if, noun, verb, stuff, comma, then, pronoun, verb, stuff. So be on the lookout for problems like this one. They're a little bit more challenging because you do have to kind of reorder some of your words and you have to add a verb to it. The easiest way I can explain it is to find the verb. If you're only given one, find that one verb, and to the left of it is the hypothesis, to the right of it is the conclusion. Let's look at another example, a little bit easier one again. Angle ABC measures 35 degrees, so it's an acute angle. Okay, that is almost an if-then statement. You can kind of clearly see how it's divided in half, but we need to write it in proper if-then form. So I would say something like this. If angle ABC measures 35 degrees, comma, then it is an acute angle. A shorter way to write that, using proper geometric notation, would be if, and then that little lowercase m, angle ABC equals 35 degrees. Instead of saying if angle ABC measures 35 degrees, you can say if the measure of angle ABC equals 35 degrees. And it's saying the exact same thing. So that's a personal preference. I obviously would take either of those answers on a test or on a quiz. They're both correct. But sometimes we like to be lazy and write as little as humanly possible. And instead of writing the whole word measures, you could just write a lowercase m in front of the angle. Alright, I want you to try this next one on your own. Go ahead and pause the video and rewrite this as an if-then conditional statement. So this is one of those harder ones, right? That it only had one verb. It's tempting to just start it out like this. If complementary angles add up to 90 degrees, then... But then there's nothing else to say, so it's confusing. This is one of the sentences where you're only given one verb. So before that verb, or before that yellow line on the screen, that's your hypothesis. And after that yellow line is your conclusion. So you could say something like, if complementary angles then add up to 90 degrees, but that doesn't quite make sense in English. We need to kind of switch it around and add some stuff to that to make it actually make sense. So instead of if complementary angles, you could say something like, if angles are complementary. So I switched around the order of complementary and angles, and I added the verb are. So instead of if complementary angles, I said if angles are complementary, then they add up to 90 degrees. I want to address one other common confusion about problems like this one in particular. I see some students write this. If an angle is complementary, then it adds up to 90 degrees. And it's so close to being right, but if you write it like this, it kind of shows me that you don't know what it means to be complementary. Complementary angles have to be a pair of angles, two of them. You can't have a single angle be complementary. Think about also the word adds. In order to add, you have to have two things, right? This plus this equals something else. If you just have a singular angle, it's not adding up to anything, it just is something. So when you say something like this, it actually sounds a lot more like right angles. If an angle is right, then it's 90 degrees. And that's not what the original sentence was talking about. It was talking about complementary angles, which has an S on it. It has to be plural because complementary angles always come as a pair. So make sure that you're writing this for your if-then conditional statement if it has to do with a pair, like complementary or supplementary or linear pairs or vertical angles, any of the things that come as a pair. You should say something like if angles are complementary, or if angles are supplementary, or if angles are vertical angles. It should be plural, not singular. So that's how you write a conditional if-then statement. But we also need something called the converse. The converse of a conditional statement is the reversal of the original statement. Whatever the hypothesis of the if-then statement was, that'll become the conclusion. And the conclusion of the conditional statement will become the new hypothesis. It is important to note that the converse will not necessarily be a true statement. We're going to talk about that a lot more in our next lesson. For now, I just want us to focus on how do I write the converse of a conditional statement. So let's look back at some of the conditional statements that we wrote earlier in this lesson. For example, we wrote that if a person lives in St. Louis, then they live in Missouri. That was our conditional statement. But now I want us to write the converse of that statement. It's still going to take a very similar form of if something, comma, then something. But instead of the original hypothesis coming first, the original conclusion is going to come first. So the conclusion of the original statement becomes the hypothesis of the converse. And the conclusion of the converse is the hypothesis of the original statement. Now, if you read back through what we just wrote, it doesn't make perfect sense, so you will again have to do a little bit of manipulating to make it look good in English. If they live in Missouri, then a person lives in St. Louis doesn't sound quite right. And that's because the noun should go in the hypothesis, person, and the pronoun should go in the conclusion, which is they. So the proper way to write this converse would be if a person lives in Missouri, then they live in St. Louis. Now you might be saying, wait, that's not true. Just because you live in Missouri doesn't mean that you live in St. Louis, and you're right. You could live in Joplin, you could live in Kansas City, you could live in Branson. We're going to talk about that a lot more in the next lesson. For now, let's just concentrate on how to write a converse properly. So let's try another example. You might remember this conditional statement that we just wrote. If a number is divisible by 10, then it is also divisible by 5. Well, we need to flip that around to make the converse. The hypothesis of the converse is the conclusion of the conditional statement, and the conclusion of the converse is the hypothesis of the conditional statement. You're just flipping around the order. So my answer here would be if a number is divisible by 5, then it is divisible by 10. You'll notice again that we kind of manipulated the way that it was phrased originally. Instead of if it is divisible by 5, we went ahead and put the noun first. If a number is divisible by 5, then it is divisible by 10. The noun should go in the hypothesis, and the pronoun should go in the conclusion. Let's try this one. If a person uses their cell phone during class, then they will have their phone taken away. Well, let's switch that around. If a person has their phone taken away, then they were using it during class. Our next example is if points are collinear, then they lie on the same line. And again, make sure your noun ends up in your hypothesis so that it doesn't say something like, if they lie on the same line, then points are collinear. That doesn't make great sense in English. Points should go in the hypothesis, that's the noun, and they should go in the conclusion, that's your pronoun. So if points lie on the same line, then they are collinear. If the measure of angle ABC is 35 degrees, then it is an acute angle. So I could switch that around and say if ABC is an acute angle, then it measures 35 degrees, or then the measure of angle ABC equals 35 degrees. Your noun on this one is angle ABC, so make sure that goes in your hypothesis. Again, I'd like you to pause the video on this last one and see if you can write the converse of this conditional statement on your own. Give it a try. If you wrote, if angles add up to 90 degrees, then they are complementary, then you did it correctly. It also means that you're ready to move on to the next lesson, which is where we talk about biconditional statements and counterexamples. What we'll discuss is what do you do if the converse is true, and what do you do if the converse ends up being false. That's coming up in our next lesson.